The following is an authorized transmission from Starfleet Command Tactical Institute. It is no longer classified.
Welcome back to Re-Examine Reads. On today's episode, I'd like to take a look at something that's been nagging at me for years. Starfleet's management of the single most important piece of property in the quadrant, the Bajoran wormhole. So a brief background. In 2369, the Cardassian Union withdrew after a 60-year occupation of the Bajoran sector. The Bajorans formed a provisional government and asked the United Federation of Planets for protectorate status, one that would lead to their eventual admission into the Federation. Starfleet took control of an old ore processing station in orbit called Terok Nor. They renamed the station Deep Space Nine, and it would become a spaceport for the planet and a base of operations for the rebuilding efforts of Bajor. A short time after taking over, the Federation discovered a stable wormhole leading to the Gamma Quadrant in the Denorius belt of the Bajoran system. Deep Space Nine was moved out of orbit to the entrance of the wormhole, allowing Bajor to affirm its claim. In a single moment, Bajor went from a backwater planet to a leading point for commerce and scientific exploration. It also became the most strategic position in the Federation as a launch point for all vessels going into the Gamma Quadrant and a receiving point for any ship coming through the wormhole. However, Terok Nor came with issues. When they withdrew, the Cardassians sabotaged just about every system on the station and looted anything of value. At the beginning of the Federation takeover, the station had almost no shields and few weapons. There were 3 runabouts that could be used to supplement the defense of the station, but they didn't add up to much. That made sense. When the station was in Bajoran orbit and before the discovery of the wormhole, there really wasn't need for a well-armed station. Once the station moved to the mouth of the wormhole, the danger increased. The Cardassians had, only a short time ago, given up what they thought was a drain on their empire, only to discover it held the biggest prize in the quadrant. They were doing all they could to make the Federation stay untenable and to retake control of Bajor. On the other side of the wormhole, trouble was brewing. In 2370, the colony of New Bajor, established beyond the wormhole, was wiped out, and the USS Odyssey was destroyed by the Dominion. Sometime in the early 2370s, the starships Sarajevo, Proxima, and the Maryland all disappeared in the Gamma Quadrant. In 2371, the weapons, shields, and power systems on Deep Space Nine got a major upgrade, complete with additional photon torpedo launchers and phaser banks. During the brief war with the Klingons in 2372, thanks to these upgrades, the station held out against a sizable Klingon fleet. However, the station would face greater threats when the Dominion War broke out. In late 2373, when the first battle of the war began, the station was attacked by a Cardassian Dominion fleet much larger than the one the Klingons had assembled. The station did not hold and was abandoned by the Federation. While it was retaken a few months later, it was under constant threat as a primary wartime target. So why didn't the Federation build a starbase at Bajor early on, instead of relying on an old ore processing station? We know there is a time frame needed of months to years for construction of such a massive structure, and events seem to keep getting in the way. There was also some political and economic reasons the Federation didn't build in that area of space. First is Bajor itself. Bajor was only a protectorate and not a full-fledged member of the Federation. To be a member, it needed to meet certain criteria such as a stable, unified government. In 2369, when the Federation assumed control of the station, Bajor had only a provisional government, and it was filled with infighting and instability among the different factions and religious orders. Had certain orders, like the group known as the Circle, prevailed and formed a new government, it would have meant the expulsion of the Federation and any non-Bajorans. That would force Starfleet to withdraw its presence from the system. Since starbases aren't mobile, they would have to leave a very large, very costly asset behind. The second reason is Cardassia. Dropping a starbase into the Bajoran sector in 2369 would have had political ramifications given its proximity to Cardassia Prime, the capital of the Cardassian Union. It could have been seen as a military buildup on their border, and the Cardassians would have to respond in kind, forcing the Federation to militarily and economically match their efforts. Although the terms of the peace treaty between the Federation and the Cardassians were never revealed, building a military installation that close to their space may have violated the terms of that agreement. We also need to keep in mind that the Federation of that time was going through great lengths to keep peace with Cardassia. The history of that era is filled with examples, from their handling of the Phoenix incident and Captain Maxwell, to the extraordinary measures taken to reallocate colonies in the demilitarized zone, to the work they put into quelling the Marquis uprising, and their handling of the incident with the Bajora at Solarian 4. The third reason is very much like the second. Placing a starbase in the Bajoran sector might have been seen by other nearby powers, such as the Zenkethi or the Breen Confederacy, as a military buildup. We know from Commander Sisko that the Federation had been at war with the Zenkethi in the not-too-distant past, and we know that their border is close enough to Deep Space Nine for the Defiant to have had a patrol rune assigned to it when they thought the old Artark had died. Again, the Federation might have had treaty reasons or a fear of an arms race that prevented them from building. The fourth reason may have been initial hope of peaceful contact with races from the Gamma Quadrant. To be met when exiting the wormhole with a heavily armed, well-defended station might have made the Federation appear warlike and militaristic. Of course, as the years went on, this became less and less of a reason. Fears of a perceived military buildup would partially explain why a large fleet of state-of-the-art Federation ships wasn't permanently stationed at Deep Space Nine. Even when the Dominion War got underway in 2373, it seemed the ships being sent to the front were older models. Notably absent from the front were the newer and more powerful Steamrunner, Intrepid, Sabre, Sovereign, and Nova classes. The ones we did see were older. The Galaxy class was launched sometime in the early 2360s and was nearly 10 years old. The Ambassador design was at least 2 decades old, and the Miranda and Excelsior designs were both in service for nearly 100 years. This may have been Starfleet's way of meeting the needs of the war, but keeping peace with neighboring empires. After the Dominion War, the justifications for building a starbase would change. Bajor would become a full-fledged member of the Federation. A starbase would become logistically necessary for the massive task of rebuilding the many planets of the Cardassian Union, including Cardassia Prime. A more secure launch point for vessels using the wormhole would be needed, and the entire political situation of that area of space would change. The Breen would join the Cardassians as a defeated power, the Klingon influence would diminish, and the Federation would be much more powerful than at the beginning of the war. So going back to the station, to quote Teddy Roosevelt, do what you can with what you have where you are. In other words, we're stuck with an old mining station as our guardian of the most strategic point in the Federation. But let's move into hypothetical territory.
Hypothetically speaking?
Hypothetically speaking.
I never learned to speak hypothetical.
Suppose we were part of a team assembled in 2371 to reinforce Deep Space Nine, and we had no treaty obligations on military strength, and we knew about the Dominion threat. What sort of upgrades could we put into place to strengthen this position without taking the months or years it would be required to build a starbase? I have a couple of ideas off the top of my head. First is more ships. A large defensive fleet deployed at the station would make the station and the entire quadrant more secure. From a tactical standpoint, it increases the defense perimeter of the station. Without ships, any combat is limited to the station's effective field of fire. With the mobility of ships, Starfleet could attack the enemy at any point and even take the fight to them. It increases the amount of firepower and targets any attacking force would have to deal with, and it allows for a greater defense of Bajor, which is outside the station's range of fire. Second, there is equipment we could put in place to supplement the station's firepower. If we placed phaser and torpedo defense platforms in orbit around the station, it would increase its firepower many-fold. Like having starships on hand, these platforms would create more targets and threats for any attacker to deal with, and it would take many more ships to take the station. Phaser and torpedo platforms have the advantage of being built quickly and easily towed or tractored into place, so construction is not an issue. Third, we could place mines around the station, much like the ones designed to block the wormhole. These, like the defense platforms, are easy to manufacture and put in place. If properly deployed, they would limit and strengthen any approaches to the station, confining attackers to specific areas where our firepower can be concentrated. Fourth, some form of fighter craft could be used. This might involve some sort of launch bay put into the station, or the building of a separate unit. This would give the station a squadron of short-range attack fighters, which would be both useful and versatile. Well, folks, that's all the ideas I've come up with to strengthen the defenses of Deep Space Nine without a massive construction project. If you have any suggestions or comments, leave them below. And before I go, if you like what you've seen, hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you really want to help the channel, share a link of this video with your favorite Star Trek fan. It would be most appreciated. As always, thank you for watching. Welcome